Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to another edition of Carnivore Radio. I'm your host, Jeff Sherman, along with the esteemed Dr. Eric Lopkin. And Dr. Lopkin, today before the show there's many reasons that we have a show together, because many people would say, I don't understand it. This is too weird for me. But you didn't say that. You actually embraced what actually, in this case, I wanted to talk about, which is very metaphysical, esoteric, but real. So I've been on quarantine for the last week. I think I'm fine. But I work from home, and I started watching, and I've talked to you before in the past about you can learn a lot from history, about history from old shows and advertising and all the above. So I'm watching this stupid show, and it is kind of stupid. It's not the greatest situation comedy ever. The Joey Bishop Show. And it's 62 to maybe 65. And what did I come away with? Yeah, Joey Bishop got lucky. But the other thing I came away with, America, the promise of America in those years, 62, it was only 20 years, less than 20 years since we won World War II. Economically, the dominant force around the world, all the promise, the amazing place America was, squandered by, I'm sorry to say, Lyndon Johnson, who gets a free pass because he was liberal, the so-called Great Society, and the Vietnam War. Your comment, Dr. Eric Lopkin.
Yeah, it really is jarring when you watch things from back then, or even shows that reference that era accurately. And now let's be realistic. We're not talking about a utopian society. There were huge flaws, huge problems to overcome, but it was the promise that it had.
No. You've nailed it. Yes, there was racial problems, but if you got out of college when college was actually college, and that's another issue for another show, in 1962, and yes, racism was absolutely a factor, but overall, my God, what a place to be. It's like the promised land. Squandered by an incompetent president who gets a free pass. Am I not correct? And is that not indicative of liberalism?
Yeah, Johnson absolutely gets a free pass. I mean, I find it amazing. I've actually spoken to people who refuse to acknowledge that he's the president that got us into the Vietnam War. I mean, this is a matter of history. We went into Vietnam under his administration, and he had this plan for the Great Society, and that was the problem, because there was nothing wrong with his goals. What he thought was going to happen were all good things. The problem was he decided that government was the one that should be spearheading this, and government programs were the way to go. And the fact of the matter is, even back in the 60s, the best and the brightest don't go into politics. So government is one of the most incompetent organizations.
Like, you and I have amazing fantasies, beliefs, but it doesn't mean they're reality. And, basically, and I do know a lot about this, is you're talking about the Great Society. Well, it's always a thing of bullets or butter. He tried to do both, and it actually sent us into the recession, the continuous recession of the 70s. Very few people know that, but it's a fact.
Yeah, well, that's something that people don't understand about recessions as a whole. Recessions don't just happen. They're generally caused by something that occurs years before the recession actually hits. And in this case,
well done, Dr. Lopkin.
It was Johnson that put things into motion, and we got hit with the recession in the 70s. The Great Recession, as much as people want to blame George Bush, was actually brought upon us by policies from the Clinton administration.
And Carter as well. Very good, though. You're 100% correct. But and for many of our listeners, it may seem something way out there, but you look at the promise of the early 1960s from average shows at best, Joey Bishop, others. And even I'll get to a point where I Love Lucy, a show I don't even like. They moved to Connecticut. Okay, it had to be something from the early 60s. And even
actually, that was the 50s.
I believe Dick Van Dyke moving to Connecticut. That was like the promised land. How things have changed, Dr. Lopkin.
Yeah, you had the early sitcoms. You had I Love Lucy taking the trip to California to see the wonderful promised land of California. Later episodes had them moving to Connecticut, away from the city. Even then, people wanted to get out of New York City. Dick Van Dyke lived out in the suburbs, and the suburbs were a big fantasy as well. Everybody was moving out. In fact, I mean, it's going a long way, but that fantasy of what the suburbs were going to be changed the face of the country. And in ways people never expected. I mean, the Dodgers and the Giants left New York City because the area was being remade to push people out into the suburbs. And so they ended up going out to California.
But from a business standpoint, if you were the Dodgers or the Giants, that would make, because that was the growing area. I mean, I guess the point is, my overall thesis is failed opportunities. America, I mean, I can't even put it into words. It's that profound, not just economic opportunities, but intellectual, societal, everything. And it got blown up, but there's no consequences. And actually Nixon gets charged with holding the bag for Vietnam when he was the one that might have got us a reputable and at least a somewhat of an honorable peace.
Right. I mean, I do find it amazing how little Americans know about the Vietnam War. And just to give our listeners a little background on it, while the United States was still involved in Korea, France was fighting in Vietnam. We got into Vietnam because France went to President Johnson and said, look, we need help. Can you help us out? We went in, France ended up pulling out, and we got left holding the bag.
And also, we didn't understand. You're talking about the best and the brightest. It wasn't about communism versus democracy. It was a civil war. And supposedly Vietnam, the best and the brightest didn't understand that the Vietnamese fought the Chinese for literally, believe it or not, 1,000 years.
Yep.
And we thought we were going to win. And the only person, the president, he was taken out probably for his own, due to his own shortcomings, unfortunately, but Richard Nixon was the only one. How do you go into a war, Dr. Lopkin, with your hand, and your strategy is you're going to kill more than they're going to kill you? If that's a strategy, please help me out. It's not like we're going to take this, we're gonna put a chokehold on their infrastructure, whatever it is. Not that we should have been there to begin with. That's another issue. If Westmoreland and his strategy was, we'll kill more than they'll kill us. And you're the president of the United States, Johnson, not the smartest guy in the world, and you say, that works for me, that's pretty incompetent.
Yeah, Vietnam was handled horribly by everybody involved in the U.S. effort. And and it's funny because there are so many myths about Vietnam that still linger to this day. I mean, if you talk to people, you say, well, the South Vietnamese didn't even want us there. And for years, I believed that because that's what I was told over and over again. And I found out because my father served in Vietnam. And after he passed away when I was 11, and after my mother passed away, years after he did, going through her things, I found letters that he wrote from Vietnam to her, describing how bad the conditions were for the South Vietnamese people, how much they wanted our help, and how much they deserved it. Because these were people fighting for their lives. And unfortunately, the global narrative became, this is a fight against communism, and it wasn't. It was a fight. It was a civil war against horrible dictators, and the fact of the matter is the people running South Vietnam weren't much better than the ones running North Vietnam.
No, they weren't, but the real question is the free pass, and how do you go into a war that took America from the promised land to something much less than that by 1969. Took, I would have to say, Reagan to get us out of that. And how do you go into a war with no strategy, no reason for success, and that's okay? I don't understand it.
Well, again, he went in with no plan, no real goals, because he was asked by the French, and he went in like he was doing the French a favor. And that you don't wage war to do somebody a favor. The French should have just pulled out.
But what is Nixon? Because he was concerned before Watergate. If he didn't get impeached, we could have had an honorable settlement, and it totally not worth the cost of what happened. But unlike Johnson, North Vietnam was scared of Nixon. He was the first time in Operation Linebacker that he took the gloves off, and they were scared because it was the first time we kicked butt.
Yeah, and I mean, why Johnson gets the free pass? Because Johnson was a liberal, and history is generally written by liberal college professors. So they, of course, put their spin because they don't want to admit that the great liberal Johnson failed them miserably.
Okay, but not just failed in a war. That happens, and I'm not dismissing that. But failed America. Took the promise of America and destroyed it. The promise of the late 50s and early 60s, an amazing place that any of us would love to be a part of, and destroyed it. That, to me, I can't believe it's not acknowledged.
Yeah, no, liberals will never acknowledge it because, again, first of all, they're writing the history books, so of course they've got to prove that their determinations were right. But, and I actually had this conversation several weeks ago with somebody who's a political consultant for the Democrats right now. And I told her point blank, she is a progressive consultant. She's helping progressives. And I told her the problem with progressives is not their ideas. It's because they don't bother to put a process in place that can reasonably succeed in achieving them. And she couldn't argue this point. And this goes back to Johnson. Yes, we want racial equality. We want everybody to have equal opportunity. But you have to put things in place. And this still goes on to this day. The Obama administration wanted to push through Obamacare. And what happened with Obamacare? Healthcare prices soared. The cost of insurance soared. Why? Because he was so focused on pushing through Obamacare, he didn't focus on rebuilding the economy, which is what he needed to do first.
And another free pass, my friend.
Yes, and he gets a free pass by the liberal elite, and the economy is part of the problem because liberals refuse to accept the reality that every program costs money. So you have to have a strong economy to be generating the income to pay for the programs.
Last thing before we go to break is that, yes, I understand, Dr. Lopkin, that I kind of disagree with you on that their goal is admirable. I mean, yeah, we all have goals. I want to be Mick Jagger. I want to be like Mickey Mantle. Just because I have a dream doesn't mean that it's attainable. I question if any of these dreams were attainable.
Well, I will answer that right after this message. We'll be right back.
To reach the next level, you need to operate at peak performance. The key to this is mastering the 7 elements of success. Learn how to master mindset, focus, operations, communications, innovation, evaluation metrics, and continuous improvement. Get the Biznetics way at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, and bookstores near you.
And we're back. And if you'd like to be part of the conversation, you can call us at 563-999-3693. That's 563-999-3693. And I think you're making a mistake because what you're saying, you want to be like Mickey Mantle, those are dreams. Those are not goals. And there's a difference between a goal and a dream. A dream is just something you'd like to do. A goal comes with a plan, comes with a process, and moves forward. And when we're talking about the goals of the people of that time, and I'm not even talking about politicians of that time, I'm talking about the American people. People wanted to overcome discrimination. They wanted to overcome the differences in, between the sexes, in equal pay. Basically, you had this promise of America, and people wanted to make sure that that promise was attainable by everybody. The problem came when government stepped in and started putting in these plans, and instead of making that goal attainable for everybody, that promise, they actually took away that promise from most of America.
Okay, and I agree with you 1,000,000,000%, and that's, yeah, you could say, yeah, I want to be Mickey Mantle, I want to be, Elvis Presley, whatever. Yeah, I get that. That was kind of a joke, obviously a joke. But it's not so far from what happened because they just threw all this stuff out there with no backup plan. If you did it in business, you'd be fired immediately. Yeah, okay, was the end result a lot better than Mr. Sherman being Mickey Mantle? Yeah, but if you don't have a plan, it's really not that much better anyway. I kind of disagree. I'm not so sure it's that much more realistic. People say, yeah, I want everyone to be equal. Well, yeah, I want the moon to be blue so I can look at a blue moon every day.
Well, the problem is they didn't have a good plan, and liberals tend not to look at the long term. And the perfect example of this is the environmental movement. Now, there is nothing wrong with wanting to protect the environment and protect our natural resources. However, we are in the position we're in now because of the failures of the environmental movement. Because back in the 70s, if you remember, toys were made from wood, not wooden metal. You went to the supermarket, you got a paper bag. Now, these are resources that are renewable, but because nobody was renewing them at the time, they were chopping down trees and not replanting, the environmental movement went nuts. So what did they do? Oh, you can't have wood toys. They need to be made of plastic. We need plastic bags, not paper bags. Well, all of that made us more dependent on oil and increased climate change. Then, as the 70s went on into the 80s, they started fighting against nuclear energy.
No, that's the biggest one. No. That's the biggest one, Dr. Eric Lopkin. That's the biggest one. I had a friend of mine's father, very smart guy, and that whole crap, I'm sorry to say, no nukes, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, they had 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. I get it. But, I'd rather live next to a nuclear power plant than a coal plant any day of the week. And his point, I'm going to ask for your opinion, he's just a middle-of-the-road guy, said, gee, look at the advancements we could have made if nuclear power wasn't, if its throat wasn't cut in 1978, which is almost 50 years ago, where would we be? You're talking about renewable energy? Same thing. Vietnam, it's the same thing. Great plans with no thought about what are we doing. Instead of saying we want to cut nuclear power, we want to end it, it's we need to make modifications. It's not black or white. Right. Nuclear power needed to be improved. And the fact of the matter is, more people have died in coal mines. Dr. Lopkin? Dr. Lopkin? Dr. Lopkin? Dr. Lopkin, are you there? Dr. Lopkin. Dr. Lopkin. Dr. Lopkin? Dr. Lopkin?